What if the cold you know today is nothing compared to the cold they feared? What if, more than 1,000 years ago, on the edge of the North Atlantic, there were people who believed winter itself was changing, growing longer, harsher, as if the world were slowly tilting toward a new age of ice? And what if their answer to that fear was not a weapon, not a prayer, but a house? Tonight, we step inside a Viking winter settlement. Timber halls buried in earth, homes built not simply to endure winter, but to survive the possibility that winter might never end. What did they know about the cold that we have long forgotten? The answer lies beneath the snow, and it begins with a fire that never went out. In early medieval Scandinavia, the year did not unfold in 4 familiar seasons. It unfolded in only 2: the cold, and the waiting for the cold to return. For older American viewers who have walked through northern winters yourselves, imagine a world where snowfall is not an event, but a landscape that never entirely melts away, where the horizon is carved from white, and every breath reminds you that warmth is something earned, not given. Here, storms rolled in from the Norwegian Sea like living creatures, their shadows stretching across water and rock long before the first flakes arrived. Wind screamed down ice-sharpened fjords, stripping bark from trees, and bending the tops of pines as if warning them to bow before winter's authority. Daylight, in the darkest months, became a precious ration, a meager allowance you measured the way others might measure grain. Villages were not arranged around streets or squares, but around warmth itself. Clusters of longhouses pressed into valleys, leaning against the shelter of forests, huddling together like families within a larger family, all seeking refuge from the endless breath of Arctic winds. And yet, even in those days, something felt different. A quiet unease threaded through conversations. People whispered that the cold arrived earlier, bit harder, lingered longer. A shift was happening, subtle, but unmistakable. The world was tilting, and the Vikings could feel it in their bones, the way seafarers feel a storm long before the sky darkens. Winter was changing, and they knew it. To survive a Scandinavian winter, a house could not simply be a roof over one's head. It had to be a machine for survival, a barrier against a world determined to freeze every living thing to the bone. Viking longhouses were long, narrow, and dim. Spaces where warmth wasn't given, it was earned. Built like inverted ships laid upon the earth, they carried the memory of seafaring even in their frames. Walls leaned inward with purpose, timbers bowed like the ribs of a hull, and every joint, peg, and beam cooperated to resist storms that could shatter ordinary buildings in a single night. Underfoot, floors held packed earth, rushes, and wool scraps. Humble materials, yet brilliant in design. Layer upon layer trapped warmth, the way a forest floor holds the last echoes of summer. Above, the roof rose thick with turf. Not dead sod, but living soil. Its heavy mass kept heat inside, the way a tundra locks in cold, creating insulation so effective that modern builders still marvel at its principle. When snow gathered on top, it strengthened the structure, pressing warmth inward like a steady, protective hand. To modern eyes, these houses might appear primitive, but they were anything but. Every angle, every material, every joint was chosen with intention, crafted with the same precision a warrior uses when sharpening a blade. And as we'll discover later, a hidden feature within this architecture may explain how the Vikings survived. A period of climatic turmoil that broke other societies. Their homes were not mere shelters. They were fortresses of warmth. At the center of every Viking longhouse, a fire lived. Not simply burned. Lived. Day and night, week after week. A steady presence as constant as breath. It wasn't a roaring blaze with leaping flames, or logs cracking in dramatic bursts. Instead, it was a disciplined bed of embers, fed by pine, birch, and driftwood, dried beneath the thin summer sun. It glowed more than it blazed, warming the hall with patience rather than spectacle. For older American viewers, This fire may echo the quiet hearths of early colonial homes. One flame, one room, one source of comfort. But in a Viking longhouse, the fire held a deeper, almost sacred purpose. It was warmth. It was light. It was food shared and life protected. But above all, it was continuity. Children played within its glow. Families slept around its edges. Elders shaped stories beside it, letting the flicker guide memory and meaning. Every spark tied the present to the past, a thread woven through generations. The smoke drifted upward through a roof vent, yet never truly left. It lingered, coating rafters in a preserving glaze, protecting the timber, warding off rot and insects that could quietly destroy a home. A Viking longhouse was not simply heated, it breathed. Warm air rising, cold air sinking, smoke pulsing through wooden ribs, like a heartbeat. And that breathing system, refined through countless winters, would one day give their descendants the knowledge they needed to cross an ocean. A winter settlement was never a scattering of separate homes. It was a cluster of longhouses gathered close, each one holding an entire lineage beneath a single roof. Within those walls, parents, grandparents, children, and newborns shared the same air, the same warmth, the same fragile thread of survival. At one end of the longhouse lived the animals, cattle, sheep, and goats whose body heat drifted upward through the packed earth floor, warming the rooms beyond more faithfully than any wooden door or woolen curtain could. At the opposite end, families slept in recessed wooden alcoves lined with fur and thick wool, spaces carved out just enough for rest, but never for solitude. Privacy belonged to summer. Winter had no patience for it. The closeness of life inside these halls was not merely cultural, it was biological. Shared heat kept infants alive. Shared breath slowed illness. Shared space stabilized the indoor climate, preventing sudden plunges in temperature that could take a life faster than hunger or frostbite. And if you pause a moment, if you listen with the imagination of someone who has lived through long American winters, you can almost hear the soundscape of those nights. The low hum of the central fire, the soft murmur of voices trading stories in the dark, the gentle shifting of cattle, the creak of timber settling deeper into the cold. And outside, beyond the turf walls and frostbitten roof, an ocean of snow pressed close, reminding everyone inside that survival was a shared task, and never an individual one. When the world turned white, food was no longer a matter of taste. It was a matter of survival, a strategy shaped by centuries of cold. Barley was stored in airtight pits, packed so carefully that not a breath of moisture could spoil it. Fish were smoked or dried into stockfish, their flesh turned rigid by Arctic winds, until it could last through months of darkness. Hard cheeses, dense and salt-rich, waited in wooden racks. Meat was buried in snow-packed trenches, frozen solid beneath the winter's own hand. And above all, there were the fermented drinks. Mead with its quiet sweetness, low-alcohol ale brewed safer than water, and sour whey, a tangy byproduct that outlasted every storm. These were not indulgences. They were winter medicine. Alcohol helped kill bacteria. Fermentation preserved nutrients, the way a deep root preserves life under frozen soil. Every sip mattered, every jar sealed with intention. As the climate grew colder during the late migration age, farmers adapted with remarkable foresight. They brewed stronger, stored deeper, rationed more strictly, not because they were fearful, but because experience had taught them that some winters stretched longer than the year before, and sometimes, spring did not come when it should. In those years, a well-kept storehouse was not comfort. It was the difference between a village that endured and a village remembered only by the stones it left behind. Winter did not freeze Viking society. It sharpened it, narrowing life down to the tasks, skills, and lessons that mattered most when the world outside turned white. Men spent the dark months repairing tools dulled by summer work, forging blades at small hearthside anvils, and carving patterns into wooden bowls and handles. quiet artistry shaped in the glow of emberlight. Women spun wool with practiced rhythm, their hands moving in the steady, timeless motion, passed down through generations. They repaired clothing worn thin by travel and wind, woven layers so dense that winter snowflakes melted the moment they touched. Elders became the memory keepers. In the dim corners of the Longhouse, they told stories not meant for entertainment, but for survival. How to read the color of a storm at the horizon, when to trust the ice on a fjord, and when to step back before it cracks. Where to build a home, and where the land itself will turn against you. These were lessons earned through years of watching, listening, enduring. Children learned early that winter was not simply a season. It was a test. A teacher that rewarded discipline and punished carelessness. By helping with chores, tending small fires, and listening to the wisdom of their elders, they stepped into a cultural rhythm older than memory. And with every winter that passed, each challenge etched deeper. A culture that grew more resilient, more cooperative, and more prepared for the centuries to come. A community shaped as much by the cold as by the hands that worked within it. Across Scandinavia, people began to sense a shift they could not name. Something in the air felt different. Something in the seasons moved out of rhythm. Later, Norse sagas would speak of long winters, harsh, lingering seasons that returned again and again, as if the land itself were drawing a deeper breath of cold. They did not know the causes, but modern science offers possibilities. Volcanic eruptions casting dust into the sky, turning daylight thin and sour. Solar minima dimming the sun's strength for years at a time. Long-term cooling cycles rippling through the North Atlantic, altering weather patterns in ways no farmer or fisherman could predict or prepare for. Whether the Vikings understood the science is irrelevant. They understood the symptoms. Harvests that once fed a household now barely filled a single barrel. Storms arrived earlier and stayed longer, their winds tearing across fjords with a force that spoke of something shifting far beyond the horizon. Animals migrated along new paths, as if following instincts sharpened by a colder world. And sea ice crept farther south, claiming waters once open to trade and travel. So their homes began to change in response. Walls thickened, built to trap every possible measure of warmth. Roofs lowered, making each structure sturdier against storms. Settlements clustered tighter, homes leaning into one another, like travelers huddled around a single fire. Every design choice, every beam, every sod tile, every insulation layer, whispered the same truth. The cold was becoming unpredictable, and unpredictable cold was the most dangerous kind of all. Here is the architectural secret hinted at earlier. The quiet innovation that transformed a simple shelter into a fortress against the northern cold. The Viking turf roof was not merely insulation. It was a climate shield, a living barrier between fragile human life and a world that often seemed carved from ice. Layer upon layer of soil, grass, and root systems formed a heavy, breathing structure. These layers trapped rising heat, absorbed moisture before it could rot the beams, and behaved like an organism in their own right, regulating humidity, softening the howl of winter winds, and distributing the weight of snow so evenly that even the heaviest storms could not break the house beneath. A turf roof could weigh several tons, yet the timber frame below did not splinter. It flexed, bending subtly the way a ship's hull bends with the sea. Here again, Viking carpentry revealed its origins, a deep memory of boat building carried onto land. And when storms raged with violent force, if a falling tree struck the side of a longhouse, the structure did not shatter. It absorbed the blow, the thick organic roof acting like a shock absorber, the walls transferring the impact through a flexible spine of wood. This resilience is why archaeologists often uncover pieces of turf roof long after the walls have disappeared. The soil stays. The roots cling. The structure endures. In many ways, the roof was the soul of the survival system, a protective shell shaped by centuries of cold, and one of the finest examples of how the Vikings engineered not for comfort, but for endurance. Winter in a Viking settlement unfolded with the rhythm of ritual. a daily choreography shaped by necessity, performed with the quiet precision of people who knew that a single mistake could cost a life. Morning began before the sun, when the house was still wrapped in darkness, and breath hung in the air like smoke. Someone rose to coax the embers back to life, feeding them slivers of birch, until the slow glow strengthened into heat. Others checked the roof load, listening for the faint groans of timber under fresh snow, and cleared drifts from the narrow entrance tunnels, so no one would be trapped inside. By midday, the settlement stirred into its harsh winter routine. Animals were fed and watered, their breaths rising in soft clouds. Water had to be gathered from springs or shorelines that remained ice-free, a task that demanded both caution and endurance. Clothing was mended, tools repaired or reforged, each item cared for as if it were a companion in survival. Evening arrived early, closing in like a second skin. Doors were sealed, smoke vents lowered to keep precious heat from escaping, and families gathered close beneath dim firelight. The darkness outside pressed against the walls, as if testing them. Above all else, there was vigilance. Frostbite lurking at the edge of carelessness, illness whispering through crowded quarters, and the ever-present danger that a single weak beam, undetected or ignored, could surrender under the weight of snow. In winter, survival was not dramatic. It was deliberate, a series of small, disciplined rituals that kept the world of ice from pushing its way inside. When winter storms struck, the kind of storms that erased the horizon, buried fences, and swallowed entire landscapes in a single night, Viking settlements did not scatter. They closed ranks. Snow tunnels connected one longhouse to another, narrow passages carved from packed drifts, allowing people to move between homes, without exposing themselves to the killing wind. Through these tunnels came shared food, shared tools, shared hands ready to help, before need ever had to be spoken aloud. Inside each hall, supplies were redistributed not by status, but by urgency. A family low on stores received what they lacked. The elderly and the sick were given warmer spaces, closer to the fire. Children were kept at the very center of the longhouse, where heat pooled thickest, and no icy draft could reach them. Elders listened to the storm, the way sailors listened to the sea. They knew the voice of timber under strain, the subtle creak that meant a beam was settling safely, and the sharp, unfamiliar groan that meant danger gathering in the rafters. Their knowledge, earned through decades of winters, was as vital as any weapon or tool. This was more than engineering. It was culture, a way of life shaped by a world where mistakes were rarely forgiven, and second chances were almost never given. In those blinding storms, survival became a collective act. Every life depended on every other life, bound together not only by walls and snow tunnels, but by an understanding as old as the settlement itself. No one survived winter alone. As the centuries passed, a subtle unease settled across northern Europe. The rhythm of the seasons shifted, sometimes by a little, sometimes by far too much. Modern scholars now believe that a minor cooling trend, what we call the late antique Little Ice Age, brushed against the early medieval world, sending quiet but undeniable tremors through the climate. The Vikings had no charts, no scientific vocabulary for atmospheric shifts, or solar cycles, or volcanic aerosols drifting high above the clouds. But they had something just as powerful: observation, and their homes were ready. Their architecture was not merely clever, it was anticipatory, a long, generational memory of winters that had overstayed their welcome. Thicker walls, lower roofs, deep-set halls sealed against drafts, and villages clustered close, signaled a culture preparing not for the winter they hoped for, but for the winter they feared might someday arrive. The question posed at the beginning, what did they know about the cold that we have forgotten, now edges toward its answer. They did not fear winter. Fear leads to panic, and panic leads to mistakes, the one thing their world never forgave. Instead, they respected winter, giving it the reverence reserved for a dangerous teacher. They planned for it meticulously. They built for its worst version, not its gentlest. They treated cold not as an enemy to conquer, but as a reality to endure. And that mindset, quiet, steady, prepared, is why their longhouses still stand in reconstructed form, and why their culture did not shatter when the climate began to shift beneath their feet. In the end, they survived because they were ready, long before the cold arrived. Step inside one of those longhouses today, restored on a cold Scandinavian morning, and the air shifts the moment you cross the threshold. You feel the weight of the walls, thick with centuries of memory. You notice the dimness inside, a kind of gentle darkness that humbles the senses. Light doesn't shine here. It settles, as if choosing its place carefully. In that stillness, you begin to understand what they understood. Outside these walls lay a world carved by ice and wind, a world not built for human comfort. Yet they lived in it, steadily, stubbornly, and with a quiet wisdom that modern eyes often overlook. These were not primitive huts. They were masterpieces of adaptation, structures shaped by a people who listened to the land, to the wind, to the long rhythm of the seasons. The houses were strong without appearing imposing, simple without being crude, and far wiser in design than their weathered timbers might suggest. And now, as we face our own questions about climate and the shifting patterns of the natural world, their story carries a whisper meant for us too. Survival does not begin when danger finally arrives. By then, it is often too late. Survival begins in quieter moments, in the choices made long before the crisis, in the preparations built into the structure of daily life, in the willingness to respect the world as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. A Viking longhouse reminds us of a simple truth. Strength lies not in resisting the cold, but in building wisely, before the cold comes. If you'd like to walk deeper into the shadows of our ancient past, to follow the stories hidden beneath ice, soil, and memory, join us again on Prehistoric Shadows, where the traces of old worlds still speak to the one we live in. In the end, the Vikings did not survive winter because they were strong. They survived because they listened to the cold.